Sarah Mitchell stared at the stack of unpaid bills spread across her mother's antique oak dining table, her fingers trembling as she traced the bold red letters stamped across each envelope. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains her mother had hung just months before, casting delicate shadows that seemed to mock the heaviness in her heart. Just 3 weeks had passed since Clara Mitchell's sudden death, and already the walls of their family home seemed to be closing in. Sarah's teaching salary barely covered her own apartment rent, let alone the mountain of debt she'd discovered hidden in her mother's study. But it wasn't just the bills that haunted her, it was the questions that came with them. "Your mother was very specific about keeping certain matters private," Mr. Peterson, their next-door neighbor, had said earlier that morning, his normally friendly demeanor replaced by something harder, more calculating. "But now that she's gone, we need to discuss the money she borrowed." The conversation replayed in her mind as she sorted through another stack of papers. Peterson had been a fixture in their neighborhood for decades, his imposing Victorian house casting a literal and figurative shadow over their more modest home. His words had carried an unmistakable threat beneath their surface politeness. $50,000 is a considerable sum, Miss Mitchell. I'm sure you understand my position." Sarah's hands clenched around a bank statement. $50,000. The number seemed impossible, yet here was the evidence: regular withdrawals from her mother's account over the past year, each one precisely timed to her father's supposed treatment sessions at a private clinic in Arizona. "Your father's medical bills were substantial," Clara had explained whenever Sarah asked about the mysterious trips. "But he's getting the best care possible. That's all that matters." Now, with her mother gone and her father still away at what she'd been told was an extended treatment program, Sarah felt the weight of family secrets pressing down on her shoulders. Peterson's ultimatum hung in the air: repay the loan within 30 days, or he would be forced to take more serious measures. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Sarah's heart raced as she quickly gathered the papers, shoving them into a drawer. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of Peterson's wife, Margaret, standing on the porch with what appeared to be a casserole dish. "Sarah, dear." Margaret's voice carried through the door. "I brought over some dinner. I know how difficult these times can be." Sarah hesitated, her hand on the drawer handle. There was something in Margaret's tone, a mixture of sympathy and knowledge, that made her skin crawl. Had Margaret known about the loan? About whatever her mother had been hiding? As she moved to answer the door, Sarah's elbow knocked against her mother's old leather desk organizer, sending it tumbling to the floor. Papers scattered everywhere, and among them, a small key fell with a distinctive metallic ping against the hardwood. Sarah froze, her eyes fixed on the key. It wasn't one she recognized, not the ornate design her mother typically preferred for her jewelry box, nor the practical ones used for the house. This key was different, modern, industrial, with a small tag attached bearing a series of numbers. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Sarah? Are you all right in there?" But Sarah barely heard it. Her attention was captured by a folded piece of paper that had fallen from the organizer, a bank receipt from a branch she didn't recognize, dated just 2 days before her mother's death. The amount listed made her blood run cold: $5,000, transferred to an account under the name Helen Winters. Who was Helen Winters? And why had her mother been sending her money? "Just a moment." Sarah called out, quickly pocketing both the key and the receipt. As she moved toward the door, her mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Her mother had always been the family's foundation, the one person Sarah believed she could trust completely. Now, standing in the growing shadows of her childhood home, Sarah wasn't sure she had ever really known her mother at all. What she did know was this: somewhere between Peterson's threats and this mysterious key, there was a truth her mother had taken to her grave. And Sarah was beginning to suspect that uncovering it would shatter everything she thought she knew about her family. She opened the door to Margaret's concerned smile, unaware that this moment, this simple act of accepting a neighbor's casserole, would be the last normal moment she would experience for a very long time. Because tomorrow, Sarah would begin to unravel a web of secrets that would change her life forever, starting with the truth about where her father really was, and why her mother had been willing to risk everything to keep that secret hidden. The bank's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the statement spread before Sarah, each line of text striking like a physical blow. Her hands trembled as she traced the pattern of transfers, regular, methodical payments that told a story so different from the one she believed that her mind struggled to accept it. These transactions don't match any medical facility in Arizona, the bank manager, Mrs. Chen, explained gently. The recipient account belongs to a private individual in Palm Springs, California. Sarah's throat tightened as she stared at the name, Helen Winters. The same name from the receipt she'd found, but this wasn't just one payment, it was dozens, stretching back over 18 months. Each withdrawal aligned perfectly with her father's supposed treatment sessions. Could you tell me anything about the account holder? Sarah's voice sounded distant to her own ears, as if she were speaking from underwater. Mrs. Chen hesitated, her professional demeanor softening slightly. I can't provide personal details, but since you have power of attorney over your mother's accounts, I can confirm that these transfers were authorized with a recurring payment agreement. Your mother set it up herself. The implications crashed over Sarah like a wave. Her mother had known. Whatever this was, wherever her father really was, Clara had known and had chosen to facilitate it with Peterson's borrowed money. Outside the bank, Sarah sat in her car, pressing her forehead against the cool steering wheel. The California address burned in her mind, hastily scribbled on a notepad during her meeting with Mrs. Chen. Palm Springs, a 4-hour drive away. Far enough to hide a secret, close enough to visit regularly. Her phone buzzed with a text from Peterson, have you made arrangements for the repayment? Time is of the essence. Sarah ignored it, instead pulling up her father's contact information. Her thumb hovered over the call button as memories flooded back, his increasingly distant behavior over the past 2 years, the way he'd brush off questions about his treatment, how he never seemed sick during his brief visits home. The call connected after 2 rings. Sarah? Is everything all right? Her father's voice carried none of the weakness she'd expect from someone undergoing intensive medical treatment. In fact, he sounded better than she'd heard him in years. Dad, she began, fighting to keep her voice steady. I need to ask you something about your treatments. A pause. Too long to be natural. Now's not a good time, sweetheart. I'm just heading into a session. In Palm Springs? The words escaped before she could stop them, sharp and accusatory. The silence that followed was deafening. When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely, harder, defensive. Who told you about Palm Springs? Mom's bank statements told me. Sarah's grip tightened on her phone. They told me about Helen Winters, too. Who is she, Dad? Another pause, then a deep sigh. Sarah, it's complicated. Your mother and I, we had an arrangement. She understood. Understood what? The pain in her chest was transforming into something else now, a burning anger that threatened to consume her. That you were using her borrowed money to what? Fund a double life? You don't understand the whole situation, he protested, but Sarah cut him off. Then explain it to me. Better yet, explain why Mom had to borrow $50,000 from Peterson to keep your secret. Explain why she died carrying that burden alone. Her father's voice cracked slightly. Your mother made her own choices, Sarah. She knew about Helen from the beginning. She chose to keep things quiet for the sake of the family, for your sake. Don't you dare put this on her, Sarah interrupted, tears streaming down her face. Don't you dare make her complicity your excuse. She ended the call before he could respond, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. The truth she'd uncovered felt like poison in her veins, her father's betrayal, her mother's silent acceptance, and the weight of debt that now threatened to crush her. The key she'd found at home seemed to burn in her pocket. Another secret, another piece of the puzzle she hadn't yet solved. But now, staring at the Palm Springs address, Sarah made a decision. She would follow this trail to its end, no matter how painful the revelations might be. She started her car, checking the time. If she left now, she could reach Palm Springs by nightfall. As she pulled out of the bank parking lot, her phone buzzed again. Peterson, no doubt, demanding an answer about the money. But Sarah's mind was already racing ahead, plotting her course toward the truth. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that Helen Winters would turn out to be so much more than her father's secret. She was about to uncover a truth that would reshape not just her understanding of her parents' marriage, but of her entire family history. And somewhere in Palm Springs, a young man who shared her eyes was about to change everything she thought she knew about herself. The Palm Springs evening painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, but Sarah barely noticed the desert's beauty as she stood before the modest craftsman house on Windmill Way. The address that had haunted her thoughts now manifested in weather-worn wood and native landscaping, so ordinary, yet holding extraordinary revelations within its walls. Her knuckles had barely grazed the door when it opened, revealing a woman whose familiar features made Sarah's heart stutter. Helen Winters couldn't have been more than 10 years older than Sarah herself, with grace etched into every line of her face. But it was her eyes, dark brown, exactly like Sarah's father's, that made Sarah's breath catch. "I've been expecting you," Helen said softly, stepping aside. "Clara told me you might come someday." The living room held the comfortable chaos of a family home, textbooks scattered across the coffee table, a half-finished puzzle, and framed photographs that Sarah couldn't bring herself to look at yet. She perched on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "My mother knew you?" The words felt thick in Sarah's throat. Helen settled into an armchair, her movements measured and calm. "Clara and I met 6 years ago. She showed up here much like you did today, looking for answers." A sad smile crossed her face. "She was much angrier than you seem to be." "I haven't decided how angry I am yet," Sarah admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. "I'm still trying to understand everything." "That's fair." Helen reached for a photo album on the side table. "Before we continue, there's someone you should meet." "Jason," she called toward the hallway. "Could you come here, please?" Footsteps approached, and Sarah's world shifted on its axis. The boy who entered, no young man, he had to be at least 16, was like looking at an old photograph of her father. The same angular jaw, the same slight curl to his dark hair. But his eyes, those were Helen's eyes. Sarah's eyes. "Hi," Jason said, uncertain but direct. "Mom told me about you." "About who you are?" Sarah stood, her legs unsteady. "How long?" she asked Helen, unable to look away from Jason's face. "How long has my father?" 20 years, Helen replied quietly. "Richard and I met when we were both teaching at community college. He was already married to Clara, but..." She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "I won't make excuses for either of us. What we did was wrong. But Jason was never a mistake." "The money," Sarah said, pieces clicking into place. "The transfers from my mother's account. Child support, officially, though it was years late in coming." Helen's voice carried a note of old pain. "Richard never acknowledged Jason legally. He'd visit occasionally, send money when he could, but it was sporadic until Clara found out. She was extraordinary in her way. She set up those transfers herself, made sure Jason would have what he needed for college." Jason shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't know about the money until recently. Mom tried to keep me from feeling like I was some kind of secret shame." The weight of it all, her mother's silent burden, her father's decades of deception, this young man who was undeniably her brother, pressed against Sarah's chest. She sank back onto the sofa, emotion welling up from some deep, previously untapped source. "Why didn't she tell me?" The question came out as a whisper. Why carry this alone? Helen moved to sit beside her, not touching but close enough to share her warmth. Clara said she wanted to protect you from having to choose sides. She thought knowing would only cause you pain. And the loan? From Peterson? Sarah asked, watching Jason settle cross-legged on the floor, his presence both strange and somehow right. Medical bills, Helen confirmed, but her tone shifted. Though not the kind you were told about. Your father, he got into some trouble. Bad investments, desperate decisions. The money wasn't just for Jason, it was to keep your father out of legal trouble that would have exposed everything. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering Peterson's threatening tone, her mother's careful smiles, all the lies wrapped in layers of protection and shame. When she opened them again, she found Jason watching her intently. I always wanted a sister, he said simply, offering a tentative smile that was so achingly familiar it hurt. Something shifted in Sarah's chest, not healing, not yet, but a realignment of her world's broken pieces into a new pattern. She reached for the photo album Helen still held, ready to learn the truth of her family, no matter how complicated or painful. As the desert sun set outside, casting long shadows through the windows, Sarah began to understand that sometimes family isn't what we're born into, but what we choose to build from the ruins of shattered expectations. And as Jason began sharing stories of his life, her brother's life, she realized that her mother's final gift wasn't protection from the truth, but the chance to discover it on her own terms. What Sarah didn't know yet was that back home, Peterson was making moves that would force her to act sooner than she planned. The truth about her father's investments was darker than even Helen knew, and it was about to put everything, and everyone, Sarah cared about at risk. The desert stars were fading into dawn when Sarah finally checked her phone. 23 missed calls, most from Peterson, but 3 from her father. Her finger hovered over the voicemail icon, her mind still processing everything Helen had shared over hours of conversation. Your father's investments weren't just risky, Helen's words echoed in her thoughts. They were desperate attempts to cover earlier mistakes. Clara never knew the full extent of it. The first voicemail played, Peterson's usually measured voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. Miss Mitchell, your father's actions have consequences beyond what you understand. For your mother's sake, call me immediately. Sarah sat in her car outside a Palm Springs diner, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of amber and rose. The night's revelations had shifted something fundamental inside her, not just about her family, but about herself. Each piece of truth she uncovered wasn't just information, it was a key unlocking parts of herself she hadn't known existed. The diner's coffee warmed her hands as she pulled up her banking app. The transfers to Helen hadn't been the only unusual patterns in her mother's accounts. There were other transactions, smaller, irregular amounts to numbered accounts that Clara had carefully documented in a small notebook Sarah had found in her desk. Mom wasn't just keeping secrets, Sarah murmured to herself. She was keeping records. The bell above the diner's door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see Jason entering. He'd insisted on meeting her for breakfast before she headed back, and something in his earnest determination reminded her so much of herself at his age that it made her heart ache. I brought something, he said, sliding into the booth across from her. He pulled out a thick manila envelope. Mom doesn't know I have this. Dad, Richard, he left it here during his last visit. I think you need to see it. Inside the envelope, Sarah found documents that made her blood run cold, loan agreements, property transfers, and emails between her father and Peterson that painted a picture far more complex than a simple neighborhood loan. Peterson's not just a creditor, Sarah realized, scanning the papers. He's been laundering money through Dad's investment schemes for years. Mom's loan was just a cover. Jason nodded, his young face serious. I overheard them arguing about it last time. Peterson's been threatening to expose everything unless Dad keeps helping him with some new development deal. That's why he's been pressuring you about the money, he needs to maintain the appearance of legitimate business. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. Every memory of her childhood was being rewritten, the friendly neighborhood gatherings, Peterson's constant presence in their lives, her father's frequent business trips. It hadn't been just a father's betrayal of his marriage, it had been a careful construction of lies built to hide something far darker. Her phone buzzed again, another text from Peterson: "Your mother understood the importance of discretion. Don't make her sacrifices meaningless." But Clara's sacrifices hadn't been for Peterson's benefit, Sarah realized. Every careful record, every documented transfer, every piece of paper filed away, her mother had been building a case, creating a paper trail that would eventually expose everything. "She was protecting me," Sarah whispered, the truth of it hitting her like a physical force. "Not from the truth about you," she looked at Jason, "but from the fallout when everything came to light. She was making sure I'd have proof of my innocence." The sunrise had fully claimed the sky now, the desert heat already beginning to build. Sarah studied her brother's face, this boy who had grown up carrying the weight of being someone's secret, yet had emerged with such clear-eyed determination to do what was right. "I need your help," she said finally. "Both you and Helen. What Peterson and Dad have been doing, it needs to stop. But we have to be smart about how we handle this." Jason's face lit up with a fierce kind of joy that transformed him from an uncertain teenager into a determined ally. "Whatever you need. We're family, right?" Family. The word held new meaning now, shaped by truth rather than obligation. As Sarah began outlining her plan, she felt something she hadn't experienced since finding that first bank statement: hope. Not the fragile hope of maintaining appearances, but the solid certainty of doing what was right, no matter the cost. What she didn't know yet was that Peterson had one more card to play, a truth about Clara's death that would shake Sarah's newfound confidence to its core. But for now, in the growing light of a desert morning, she was no longer just a daughter discovering her father's betrayal. She was becoming something else entirely, a woman ready to fight for justice, even if it meant dismantling every comfortable lie her life had been built upon. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she could almost hear her mother's voice: "Sometimes the greatest act of love is letting the truth come to light, no matter how much it hurts." The key Sarah had found in her mother's desk drawer turned out to belong to a safety deposit box at a small bank across town. As she turned it over in her hands, sitting in the sterile consultation room, she felt the weight of her mother's foresight pressing against her chest. Clara hadn't just been keeping secrets, she'd been leaving breadcrumbs for Sarah to follow. "Your mother accessed this box frequently in her final months," the bank manager explained, leaving Sarah alone with the metal container. "The last time was 2 days before her passing." Inside, Sarah found more than documents. She found her mother's true legacy, a carefully constructed case against Peterson and her father, meticulously documented evidence of their financial schemes, and a letter addressed to her in Clara's elegant handwriting. "My dearest Sarah. If you're reading this, I've either found the courage to tell you everything, or I'm no longer able to protect you from the truth. I hope you'll understand that every choice I made, even the ones that seemed like weakness, was part of a longer game. Peterson isn't just a neighbor with a loan. He's been using your father's investment firm to launder money for years. The evidence is all here. I've been gathering it, piece by piece, making sure it would stand up in court when the time came. I wanted to shield you from this ugly truth, but I realize now that protecting you meant preparing you to face it on your own terms. You're stronger than you know, Sarah. Stronger than I was for too long." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the final paragraphs. "There's something else you need to know. The night I confronted Peterson about what I discovered, he made threats. Not just about exposure or financial ruin, but about you. About Jason. That's when I realized that silence wasn't protection, it was complicity. If anything happens to me, know that I made my choice with clear eyes. The truth may cost us everything we thought we had, but living with lies costs us everything we truly are. All my love. Mom." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The official report had listed her mother's death as a heart attack, but now everything shifted into terrible focus. The timing, the mysterious visits to doctors that had no records, the way Peterson had inserted himself into the funeral arrangements. But Clara hadn't left her daughter defenseless. In addition to the documentation of financial crimes, there were records of conversations, dates, times, and most damning of all, a USB drive containing recorded conversations that Clara had somehow managed to capture. Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from Jason. Mom found something else. Old emails between Peterson and Dad from before Clara died. It's bad, Sarah. Really bad. She closed her eyes, feeling the pieces of her mother's puzzle finally coming together. Clara hadn't been a victim, not really. She'd been a warrior, fighting a silent battle to protect both her children and ensure justice would eventually prevail. With trembling fingers, Sarah dialed a number she'd found among her mother's papers, a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. As she waited for the connection, she thought about Jason, about Helen, about all the lives tangled in this web of secrets and lies. This is Agent Roberts. Sarah took a deep breath, channeling her mother's quiet strength. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I have evidence of a money laundering operation involving James Peterson and Richard Mitchell. And she paused, steadying her voice, I have reason to believe they may be connected to my mother's death. The next hour passed in a blur of detailed explanations and arrangements. When she finally emerged from the bank, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Her phone showed missed calls from Peterson and her father, but they no longer held any power over her. She called Helen. I need you and Jason to come stay with me for a few days. It's not safe there anymore, not once this starts moving. We're already packing, Helen replied, surprising her. Jason showed me the emails. Sarah. I had no idea how deep this went. Neither did I, Sarah admitted. But Mom did. She knew everything, and she left us the weapons to fight back. We just have to be brave enough to use them. As she drove home, Sarah felt a profound shift in her understanding of strength. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It was about the quiet courage to face truth, to protect others, to stand firm when the easy path would be to look away. The sun was setting when she pulled into her driveway, casting an orange glow across Peterson's imposing house next door. Tomorrow would bring FBI interviews, legal proceedings, and the unraveling of decades of careful deception. But tonight, in this moment, Sarah felt her mother's presence more strongly than ever. I understand now, Mom, she whispered to the gathering darkness. Sometimes the greatest act of love is having the courage to bring everything into the light. What she didn't know yet was that Peterson had already sensed the shifting winds. Even now, he was setting in motion events that would force Sarah to make an impossible choice, one that would test every lesson her mother had taught her about truth, justice, and the real meaning of family. The autumn evening wrapped around Sarah's childhood home like a familiar blanket, but nothing else felt familiar anymore. Jason and Helen were settling into the guest rooms upstairs, while Sarah sat in her mother's study, surrounded by the echoes of a life she was only now beginning to truly understand. The FBI had moved quickly, but Peterson had moved faster. His last desperate gambit lay before her in the form of a thick manila envelope that had appeared on her doorstep, photographs of her father signing questionable documents, records of offshore accounts in Clara's name, carefully constructed evidence that could implicate her mother in the entire scheme. You have until midnight to withdraw your claims, Peterson's message read. Or your mother's reputation dies with her. Consider carefully what Clara would have wanted. Sarah traced her fingers over her mother's handwriting in the margins of an old ledger, feeling the slight indentations where Clara had pressed harder with certain words, as if trying to embed truth itself into the paper. I know exactly what she would have wanted, Sarah whispered to the empty room. The sound of footsteps drew her attention. Jason stood in the doorway, his young face carrying a maturity beyond his years. Peterson's leaving his house, he said quietly. Loading boxes into his car. Sarah nodded, a calm settling over her that felt almost surreal. He's running. Just like Dad tried to. Their father was already in custody, having attempted to flee to Mexico that morning. His final message to Sarah had been both a plea and a confession: I never meant for any of this to happen. I just couldn't stop once it started. The lies, they have a gravity all their own. Rising from her mother's desk, Sarah moved to stand beside her brother. In just days, their unlikely bond had grown into something profound, not built on shared memories, but on a shared understanding of truth's power to both destroy and heal. Do you ever wish you didn't know? Jason asked suddenly. About any of it? Sarah considered the question carefully, watching Peterson's shadowy figure through the window as he rushed between house and car. No, she said finally. Knowledge isn't the burden. Secrets are. Mom understood that in the end. Her phone buzzed, Agent Roberts confirming that teams were in position. Peterson wouldn't make it past the county line. But Sarah's thoughts weren't on his arrest or even on justice anymore. She was thinking about the journey that had brought her here, about the quiet strength it takes to face truth rather than hide from it. Helen appeared with 3 mugs of tea, passing them around with a maternal grace that made Sarah's heart ache with both loss and gratitude. They stood together, this unlikely family born from shattered illusions, watching as red and blue lights suddenly illuminated the street outside. It's not just about catching them, is it? Helen asked softly. Sarah shook her head. It's about choosing who we want to be in the aftermath. Mom could have exposed everything years ago, but she waited, gathered evidence, made sure the truth would protect us all when it finally came to light. As they watched Peterson being led to a waiting car, Sarah felt the last pieces of her old life falling away. But unlike before, the sensation wasn't one of loss, it was liberation. Every broken truth had created space for something more authentic to grow. Later that night, after the chaos had subsided and the house had quieted, Sarah returned to her mother's study. The moonlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting familiar patterns that now felt like her mother's final gift, a reminder that beauty can emerge from even the most tangled circumstances. She opened her laptop and began to write. Dear Mom. I understand now what you tried to teach me through everything you did. Strength isn't in maintaining appearances or protecting comfortable lies. It's in facing truth with open eyes and an open heart. It's in choosing to build something real from the ashes of what we thought we knew. You didn't just leave me evidence against Peterson and Dad. You left me a blueprint for living with integrity, for turning wounds into wisdom. Most importantly, you left me the courage to choose truth, even when it hurts. Jason asked me today if I regret learning everything. I don't. Each painful revelation has been a step toward something more authentic. You knew that's what I would need most, not protection from the truth, but the strength to face it and grow. Your last gift wasn't the evidence that brought justice. It was showing me that even in the darkest moments, we can choose light. We can choose truth. We can choose to build something new from what remains. I love you, Mom. And I finally understand, sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what we're given, but what we choose to build from what we learn. Love. Sarah. Sarah sat back, feeling the quiet rightness of the moment settle around her. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, legal proceedings, family restructuring, the long process of healing. But tonight, in the gentle darkness of her mother's study, surrounded by the love of her unexpected new family, Sarah knew she was exactly where she needed to be. The truth had cost her the life she thought she knew, but it had given her something far more precious, the chance to build a life based on authenticity, surrounded by people who chose truth over comfort, love over appearances, and courage over fear. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy Clara could have left, not the evidence that brought down Peterson and Richard, but the understanding that true strength lies in facing reality with grace, and building something beautiful from the pieces of broken illusions.